There we go. So, everybody, welcome to our third installation of Meet the Candidates. We were hoping to have Justin, Andy, and who else was coming tonight?
Daniel Fowler.
Daniel Fowler. Anyway, we ended up with a few distractions and ended up taking them out of the loop, so they're not going to be able to be here tonight, join us. Well, they may or may not, but they're not here yet. So, with that, let's go ahead and get started. Now, I'm Joe Evans. I am the U.S. candidate for U.S. Senate for the state of Idaho. And we got Joe Morrison here, and he's running for Congressional District 1. Okay, that's the seat currently held by Russ Fulcher. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started here this evening. So, Joe went ahead and forwarded a couple questions. And let's go ahead and start with number one here. So Thomas Massie has the Prime Act. He's been working on that since July to try and get it through. Now, the big thing with the Prime Act is it deregulates small farms so that you can do farm to table, farm to fork, in states for small scale farmers, gentleman farmers, the ones who aren't running the industrial grade, industrial size arrangements that we see so often. The ones who are dependent upon finding a slot in one of these FDA-approved warehouses that are owned by one of the 4 major meat packers in the U.S. So, Joe, go ahead and start. How do you feel about that?
I really like it. I really am in support of the Prime Act. I think that we should be pushing for more farm to fork inside the state, especially taking some of that federal regulation that is overhead on everything that we have currently and letting the states handle it. There's no reason that we shouldn't increase the barrier to entry when trying to build these businesses. And that's how I see is a barrier to entry having this federal oversight on these.
And that's one of the big things with regards to the nature of states versus federal. Now, I believe the federal, particularly with the FDA, has done an awful lot of commerce clause, in order to secure control and move it up to the federal level where the feds control all of the regulations here, and all across the United States, saying, hey, you can't do this because it's unfair competition to your neighboring state. You can't do that. We saw it a while back when the canning companies went through a lot of trouble because to get stricter regulations, for Libby's and many of the others. And it affected a lot of the volunteer organizations. One of those here in the state of Idaho and Utah was the LDS volunteer canneries. The increased regulations made it harder for them to continue to do their volunteer work. Work in the canneries and provide inexpensive and affordable food for members of their community, as well as the poor in the community. It was going to run into a situation where it's going to impact the homeless people and those people dependent upon food banks in order to extend the life, make their money go a little bit further. So from a federal perspective, Thomas Massie actually needs to be successful in getting the Prime Act through if we're going to be able to do the deregulation at the state level successfully. Be able to get those small scale farmers, the ones that are running 40 acres, that probably sell 5-6 head of cattle a year, be able to get them to do the farm to fork arrangements.
Mm-hmm.
So again, this comes back to making sure that the arrangements and the balance is there between the federal and the state. You need somebody at the federal level in order to open up the door so the state can step in and take it the final 9 yards. What more have you done on taking a look on that, Joe? From your perspective.
I don't know what else kind of work I've looked at it, but I was looking at the bill and it looked like it had a lot of co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle, some Democrats and majority of Republicans on this Prime Act. There's like 39 co-sponsors on this. And so it does look like it is pretty well popular with inside the Senate at least.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of those things Joe and I agree on, and it's definitely very much a support the farmer. And it helps keep business interests local. You now know who's making your food, who's growing your beef. You can head over and buy a quarter, buy a half, go in with a neighbor or three,
Right.
end up picking up some decent deals over the year. But we need to be able to open up the options for the slaughterhouses at the local level, or being able to let them do it on site at the farms.
Exactly. And the supply train for this, the supply line, instead of shipping cross nationally or something in that nature, you're coming from, down in Grandview or somewhere local, somewhere smaller, and that's gonna eat at that overhead of gas as well, or fuel rather.
Right. And that's one of the things, like the FDA or the approved USDA slaughterhouses, there's only like about 6 or 7 of them, and they're in key locations. By being able to go with the Prime Act and open up several options, even including slaughter at the farm, before being able to take it into a processing plant or a butcher to finish taking it to the rest of it, you shorten the supply chain. Right now, Nebraska is one of the areas where they go to fatten up the cows before they turn around and release them. Stockyards, all the same problem. You end up not with grass-fed, but you end up with mass production, trying to make weight in order to sell for the maximum dollar. Here in the state of Idaho, you want to buy grass-fed beef, just head over. Except you don't have that option as long as the USDA controls the supply chain, as long as everything has to be contracted through the Commodities Market Exchange out of Chicago.
Yeah.
So
I know you've talked about that a little bit, the Commodities Market Exchange, the that's the corn and everything like that. That's crazy history there in the Commodities Market Exchange.
Oh, it is. It's incredible. You and I remember Trading Places with Eddie Murphy. The whole deal was about the Florida orange juice. Was it going to be a good market year or not? The entire plot revolved around the commodities exchange. So I think we've beaten that one enough here. So let's go ahead and move over, take a look at the next one that you had up. This one's fun. So the Fuel Emissions Freedom Act. Now, if it does what it says, what do you think that means for America, especially with what's going on with the Strait of Hormuz and Iranian oil and the global supply of gasoline right now?
Well, so with those variables in place, I do think that we need to be pushing more towards fuel efficiency, but and even in that aspect of it, there are machineries out there that are working as efficient as possible. Adding these extra like DEF or anything else like that, I think is a string too far. A lot of times in the climate change issue, and I feel like this falls a lot alongside of that climate change issue. I feel like we push it to the little person far too often instead of moving into the these big power plants that are generating 90% of the power for the East Coast. They're not all running on wind or hydro out there, nuclear even. So in my opinion, I feel like allowing people to use the fuel that they want or need for their work or their day-to-day driving and everything like that is a step in the right direction. But I also feel like we need to push our overall output from oil to more either cleaner energy, such as like nuclear, in my opinion. Yeah, I think we should be pushing towards more something that's going to have a lot more output for the energy that you put into it. And I don't think that we should be putting such more burden on the average person as we do on where we actually use a lot more oil and gas.
Right. So one of the big things that's kicked this off is, of course, the war with Iran right now. Strait of Hormuz, right now, the estimate is that the damage that's been done to the oil fields in Qatar, Iran, Iraq, as well as several of our other allies in the Middle East, has cut the global supply of oil and gasoline anywhere from 20 to 40% already. You know, if you do any amount of driving, if you stop by the gas station to fill up your tank here recently, it hurts a lot. In addition to that, in order to make the fuel under current regulations because of the EPA, it's significantly more expensive, especially when you're looking at the ethanol 10 and ethanol 15 brands that integrate a lot of that biodiesel, biofuels such as corn, ethanol, and so on. So what is it we need to do to actually take a look, not just at the fuel that we use for our cars, especially since we've done a lot of migration to electric vehicles. You know, we see them all over the place now. Tesla has theirs, Ford, you know, so we aren't limited to gasoline and diesel these days like we used to be for major transportation. You know, the other thing is we can also use smaller vehicles. The big thing right now with the size of the vehicles that we're expected to use because of safety regulations, you know, means that you're using more gas to move heavier vehicles when in most cases, you know, getting around town. Golf carts can get up to about 35 miles per hour, which is the speed limit for most of the streets within Boise city limits, you know, as well as most towns around, you know, little rural golf cart type arrangements, short, cheap, and easy to charge up, run on a battery for an hour or two, get where you need to go, come back. You know, so we can look at electric vehicles again, as well as alternative fuels. You know, there's no reason we need to stick with just the gasoline like we currently do, which was made popular by none other than Rockefeller when, you know, he was running Standard Oil, and him and Ford got together and decided the only way a car was going to get made was if it was ran on Rockefeller oil and gasoline. You know, we can get back to looking at alternative fuels, including batteries.
Yeah.
Now, one of the other things that we look at with electricity and nuclear, both of which are hydropower and nuclear, both of which are real big products here in the state of Idaho. You know, for a while, 80% of our electrical production was done via hydro. Nuclear has the capability. It's been badmouthed a lot due to certain individuals, you know, certain companies and organizations not doing the proper regulations with it, you know, but we've gone through several iterations, several generations of nuclear fuel and nuclear plant designs. So the nuclear power is actually affordable these days. It's safer and can provide so much more power than just about anything else we got. You know, it's crazy. One of our viewers talks about hemp. You know, hemp for gasoline.
Oh, I haven't heard of that.
Yeah. Well, hemp is one of those things that can be easily converted for diesel.
Interesting.
You know, because it's a biofuel. You know, it's living fuel, biodiesel. You know, several of the other options that we got with regards to that. You know, not just corn. You know, one of the things that we do right now with the ethanol, with the corn, thank you, Ohio, for all of your lobbying in order to get ethanol into, you know, corn alcohol into gasoline, you know, to the detriment of engines all across the United States.
Not only engines, but the farm itself. Because that can be food instead. It's diesel or gas. It's not being
Well,
used.
it's like all the corn that we currently process right now. A lot of it doesn't even go for food. Like you said, we've used it for fuel. We use it for ethanol. We turn it into corn syrup. We turn it into animal food. We use it to, and it's ironic because the thing is most of the animals we feed it to in order to fatten it up, corn's actually bad for them. So we got this whole loop going on with the Ohio cornfields, feeding our food and going into our gas, and the amount of that actually gets turned into food itself. There's an awful lot of money going into corn right now. Welcome to the commodities exchange in Chicago again.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, you mentioned it. Idaho's big proponent for hydropower.
Mm-hmm.
We've been using it for a long time. We actually export an awful lot of hydropower from the state of Idaho. The Boise or the Lucky Peak Reservoir is a hydroelectric powered dam, and all of the electricity from there is actually generated and sold to Seattle Lights in Seattle, Washington. So we export it to the point where we're actually powering Seattle, Washington.
Right.
In addition to the dams that we got on the Snake River and Columbia and several other locations. And of course, INEL, the Idaho National
Laboratory.
INL.
It used to be INEL,
Right.
Idaho National or Nuclear Energy Laboratory or National Energy Laboratory, but now it's just INL.
Yeah, Idaho National Laboratory. And they're one of the key performers in creating those safer nuclear plants, and designing them, working with them, and doing research not just on other fissile materials as well.
Yep. I wanted to touch on this hemp as well. I've heard a lot of good things about it. I don't know how much it's been actually researched, but I've seen like hemp blocks that are fireproof and yeah, and they're just really like a solid product. And from my understanding is it grows pretty quickly. And from my opinion, it is one of those underutilized roots because of the fibrous nature. It's
Right.
so useful for a lot of different things, and you could really throw some hemp farms up and have some good building materials, and like you said in here, plastics. I didn't know about the gas, but there's gas as well, and it'd just be a better overall. I really like hemp and hemp blocks and stuff like that too.
Well, that's actually interesting because one of the reasons why hemp was criminalized so much following World War, early on, was because it was a competitive material for an awful lot of industries here in the United States at the time. You could use it to make paper, which of course competed with the lumber market. You could use it to make clothing, which competed with the cotton market. You could use it in order to make biofuels, which competed with Standard Oil. It is itself its own natural medicine, which was competing with the American Medical Association, various forms of treatment that was coming out of the pharmaceuticals early on. And, it was just so many markets were looking at that going, last thing we need is competition. So let's do everything we can to make the one thing that could impact us the most criminal in the United States. And it's like literally everybody got on board, and next thing you know, a material that we were using to make ropes for sailing ships, prior to in the early 1800s, was now criminal across the United States. It's just amazing how quickly they were able to pull that off. Okay. I think this one's your area here. Derivative markets, call sheet, poly market, and the new stock trading applications. Honestly, it sounds like betting to me.
Right. Yeah, and that really delves a lot into it, in my opinion. I saw the Attorney General, Raul Labradoro. I can't
Yeah.
pronounce his last name. My apologies. He was posting in regards to it as well the other day. Um, it's something that Utah is taking a look at because of the gambling aspect of it, and but it's trading and on the margins of whether this is going to beat this person or that. They literally put anything and everything in there, and since it's such a new technology and the smartphones and applications, a lot of people aren't aware of it, and they aren't aware that it's even worse than DraftKings in regards to you can put like pennies on the dollar into bets for these margins, these betting markets. So it's coming, and I do think that we as and I know Idahoans, I can't even download DraftKings. Not like I'm a huge gambler by any means, but I I don't see why we're not getting out ahead of this. Especially in Idaho, where we do hold such a line on gambling of like we're going to make sure lottery is completely regulated, um and then you can't download those DraftKings or anything else like that, and it's pretty much the same thing, in my opinion, from what I've seen.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting thing. The amount of work that was put into getting the lottery through, uh, so that we could purchase the tickets here in the state of Idaho, was incredible. I think it was one of those things that only reason it was able to go through was that they had done the initiative process for it, because they weren't going to be able to get it through the state legislature.
Right.
But yeah, Idaho and our legislature, especially when it comes to gambling, it's fine if you want to do sin tourism, go ahead, head out of state, go somewhere else to do it. There's certain sins that we don't want inside city limit, inside the state of Idaho. You know, Legislature is real huge on that whole. Trying to remember the term for it. Where you don't drink. Um, but about the purity of the soul. Being able to make sure that the temptations aren't here where they can affect families. Or they're regulated in such a way that it can be controlled, that it minimizes the potential for damage and allows people to get help in a timely manner. So being able right now to go on and take a look at what's going on with the latest bet, figuring out who's going to win, which party's going to win Congressional District 1,
Right.
in the state of Idaho, what are the chances of the Democrats winning that seat you're running for? What is it, like 2% right now? Yeah. But yeah, it's like you said, it's crazy because it's literally anything and everything. Bet on the over and under versus how long Trump's going to speak at the State of the Union.
Right, 100%. There's a big piece on that, and a lot of betting on, and these Kalshi markets, these poly markets, these derivative markets. They allowed a lot of insider trading into it as well, uh,
Right.
because you're going to be able to either throw the game, if you will, in quotation marks, of saying like, well, I put X amount of money on this, so I'll just make sure that it stays around this time, or and it opens up a lot of corruption and the ability to just use and abuse the system. And I really think that we need to get out ahead of it and regulate it at least. Just the same as you're handling any DraftKings or anything else like lottery, 21. If they find that you're having like an addiction to it, you can have Gamblers Anonymous. Just how we handle any other addiction or anything else in the state of that caliber. I think it should be in the same.
So talking about insider trading, what do you think about that massive sell-off of oil just before Trump's Monday announcement of talks with Iran?
I know it's a lot. I know it's like 1.5 bill. That was so much money. I don't, I don't even. It's blatant. It's blatant corruption. They're robbing us blind, in my opinion. Um, to be fair, if you're watching the war in Iran, if you're paying attention to that the theater of war there, you're gonna be able to notice that this is what he's doing is he wants the markets to be calm during the week, calm, stable, and then he'll do his thing on the weekend, and then he wants to reopen the markets at a stability, and you can see it. It's pretty clear as day of that's what's happening.
Yeah, the announcements that he has, the more notice that's being made of the timing of key trades, huge trades, no less. We've identified the pattern. Iran's identified the pattern. Most international bodies have identified the pattern. We want to say it's inside, but let's be honest, Trump's developed this pattern on his own. Some of these trades no longer need to be insider trading simply because he's been telegraphing this move every week for the past 4 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's no longer insider trading, it's a pattern, but it still looks bad.
Yeah.
Um,
and yeah, that whole Iran deal, like I've heard some of the news reports I've been seen too, saying that some of these countries are trading in yuan now too, instead of the petrodollar, which is
right. Qatar's already trading in yuan. Several of the others. And Qatar was one of our allies right up until Israel shot up the oil fields that were jointly run between Qatar and Iran.
Yep.
It didn't take them long to realize it's like, yeah, okay, long as you're back in Israel, we're selling our oil somewhere else. That's an interesting development. So, talking about energy, particularly with regards to nuclear and hydro, the AI data centers. How would you go about handling this? It's new tech, it's big, but it's a resource hog. We're talking water, we're talking electricity, and all of this for basically what steals, takes over our personal responsibility for human creativity, with what is pretty much nothing more than plagiarization and, mimicry of human art.
Right. Yeah, no, I do think that there needs to be more research regulations on the AI data centers, and not only that, but before they put them in, they need to offset those costs, whether that be electricity, water, sound, whatever cost it is. We haven't done the appropriate amount of research on these objects, and that is one of those things about Idaho that I've always loved, because we have had INL here for generations at this point. So
Yeah.
we've had exploratory technology here, but we also understand that it's exploratory technology, and we need to be handling it as such. We need to be making sure that we're following appropriate regulations. We need to be implementing those regulations as they push through. We need to be cautious and optimistic of it, but we need to be cautious of it, because I do think that there are spaces for AI and AI data centers, but we're not. Let's not put the cart before the horse. Let's figure, because I do see that we can put AI into manufacturing, or um, using it for fertilizer for farms, reforestation. I've seen them use drones for reforestation as well. So there's a lot of uses for it, and I think that there is places that we can use it. But let's do a little bit of research on it. Let's test it out. Let's regulate it out to make sure that we're not shorting ourselves on the back end from water, electricity standpoint of it, and sound if it's creating too much sound, stuff like that. We need to figure it out.
So that's another interesting thing, especially when we're looking at the federal level versus the state level. So we've already seen several states get out in front of this, trying to regulate AI before the feds can regulate AI. Part of this is about the 9th and 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution. You know, the powers that the state moves on first are basically retained by the state. If the state waits until the feds move on it, then it becomes a federal power, and it's harder for the states to shake, you know, whatever federal regulations come out later. So Idaho has done regulation of AI. Texas has done regulation. There's a couple others that have done it as well, mainly to make sure that that is a power held by the states. You know, what is the level of AI that you're able to use in the state of Idaho versus what can you use AI for in California or Georgia and so forth and so on. Now, there's an awful lot of people that say, hey, you know, we should be able to use AI the same way all across the United States. So that's one of those things where at the federal level, you and I, where we would be operating versus the state level, if we made regulations regarding AI in an attempt to overrule the states, you know, we now turn that into a federal thing rather than a state thing. So I agree. We need to understand it. We need to know where it's going. The last thing I want to do is create a scenario ripe for either, you know, Skynet or a future Butlerian jihad, for those of you who follow Dune out there. You know, but again, it also comes back to what are we going to use it for? So one of the things that we've noticed, particularly with Gen Z, is the decline in cognitive function. Mm-hmm. Because we've given them more screen time and more tech for learning rather than actually having them think in school, think in education. You know, regardless of how you feel about the Department of Education and what it's done to us overall, you know, we generally saw the next generation always being at least a little smarter than the generation before. Current generation that's graduating from high school has some of the least cognitive function of high school graduates, and it's documented, you know, and most of it is because of the amount of tech that we've started inserting into the classroom. You know, we let them use AI. College, they teach them how to use AI in order to be able to do better at the tests and exams in the rest of their classes. So it's like they're teaching the tools and they're losing an ability that was native before the tools. Yeah, they're understanding how the tools work, but they're using it as leverage rather than actually building their own cognitive functions. So we really got to be careful, and we need to make sure that it's being used in an appropriate way. We can't just let AI go haywire. We can't let the AI start thinking for us, which in a lot of ways is what we're doing.
And yeah, exactly. And I agree with that too. And it's one of those issues to me where I feel like we watch these big tech companies talk about AI as if it's going to be omniscient. And I don't think that it'll ever get to that point. I think it'll logarithmically get closer and closer, but never get to a point where it is completely omniscient or thinking by itself or anything in that nature. And I think we're focusing in on the wrong spot on the AI. Like I said, manufacturing, I think we could use it for helping with manufacturing, reforestation, farming. I think there's a lot of other uses that we could use it for to actually assist and help develop our society. But I don't think that the direction they're traveling with AI currently is the correct direction in which we should be traveling.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things about AI right now is they're still using machine language. You know, we call it AI, but it's large language models. It's still machine learning. We haven't been able to make the quantum leap. We're just throwing more power at the problem set rather than actually looking at the variables that go into the, options. Everything that we're dealing with in AI is still very binary. We're using brute strength in order to overpower that binary to give a simulation of something that's more complex. But when you take a look at the human brain, that part of us, our body, and what's represented in our mind, we got something like 24 different chemicals that run around in our brain. Dopamine, endorphin, serotonin, continuing on and on. We got different genetic proclivities. We handle trauma in different ways. The variety of expectations because of the balance of the chemicals in our head is just so insane in the amount of energy options that are created. We talk about quantum physics, quantum computing. All of that chemistry inside our brains that gives us creativity, gives us options, allows us to think and process, allows us to maintain our balance, fuel our body, think about ideas and concepts, and gaze at the stars and contemplate our existence. That's not done with bytes. That's not done with an on-off switch. We literally got quantum computing in our head because we're working with some, over 24 different on-off switches on a regular basis.
Right, and in a smaller scale than what any engineering can figure out currently. Otherwise, they wouldn't need these huge, massive data centers.
Right,
it would be something that would fit in the palm of your hand.
That's why you talk about the energy consumption involved in this. All the energy that we've created, all the energy that we've produced using fossil fuels, using solar, using David, come on. Get that robot made.
They're coming.
Yeah. The amount of power that's involved in just the brute strength that they're trying to throw at this, we don't make enough power on the planet right now in order to fuel all of the AI data centers that they actually want to build and create.
Right.
As it is, we're starting to curtail the amount of power that we use as humans in our day-to-day lives. They're charging us extra just so that they can make the power consumption affordable for these AI data centers. We're reaching a point right now where we have to go nuclear, just to be able to power the number of AI, and the data centers that they want to build. While we watch, 4 major tech companies shuffle money around, buying, each other's services,
exactly,
in order to produce the next, revenue
AI slop
generator.
video.
Well, yeah, it's AI slop. We're literally watching, AIs laundering money for corporations that are building AIs.
It's absolutely insane. Yeah, the AI data bubble is scary to think about and look at and talk about. But that's also like when rubber meets the road, where I'm looking at it and reality of it is if the AI is coming and we're gonna be needing to be pushing energy 10-fold, 100 times fold. We're exporting energy currently with hydroelectricity, but we need to be exporting more. In order to either offset or prevent more AI data centers inside the state of Idaho, we need to be creating so much more energy that we can have it as the net exporter to these other states and create some sort of profit possibly on it. Exporting energy to an AI data center would be a great revenue source of revenue.
Right. And this goes back to the fuel emissions project, because Idaho is if we could get back to where we're actually doing mining in the state of Idaho, safe, sane, ethical mining, extraction from the earth. We have plutonium, we have thorium, we have several different fissionable materials as well as rare earth minerals here within the state that are easily reachable. They're good resources. They work extremely well for tech. And being able to convert that thorium and the plutonium into nuclear energy, building the plants, just being able to build the plants here, mine it, and then send the energy, send the electricity out across the grid to our neighboring states, into the U.S. grid, and being able to sell it anywhere in the United States. Just the amount of energy that we can produce here using those minerals natural to the state of Idaho. That's an energy industry, that's a mining industry, as well as a tech industry, all of it rolled into one. And it's right here in the state.
Mm-hmm.
And we are not taking advantage of what that means because of the way we handle our resources.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Big one. Voter fraud. Okay, we talk about voter fraud and the SAVE Act, and here in the United States, in the various areas, we see voter fraud happening in blue states. It's been identified in several areas. There's claims that it even happens in red states. What's your thoughts? From a federal level, how would you approach it over in the House?
So I'm opposed to the SAVE Act and the in regards to mostly pushing aside state sovereignty. I feel like it is accepting a big gov more responsibilities for the federal government, and in my opinion, the federal government has far too many responsibilities as it stands. We don't need to be adding more to the state. Every time we add something to the federal government, it requests more money from us. So I kind of see the SAVE Act as a Trojan horse in that aspect of it's giving up state sovereignty for federal government. Here in Idaho, especially, Secretary of State Phil McCrane, he said that. So there's 11 instances of illegals voting, and I think altogether there was 36 instances of voting illegally.
Yeah.
And in a state that 1 million people vote, that's inside the margins. That's 0.001%. It's not a big issue to me in this state. I don't think it's that big of an issue to where we should be pulling it to the federal level versus the states' rights level. And there's only, I think, if the last time I looked, there's like 10 to 15 states that don't require some sort of voter ID. So these are inside the margins, in my opinion. If we're really wanting to do, I know in the past they've made rules to where you wouldn't be able to get certain federal funding unless you did this XYZ. I don't understand why wouldn't we be able to do something in that regards to voter ID instead of passing a SAVE Act. Just like take away some federal funding from these states that don't have the voter ID or something like that.
Right. So this was actually a topic I brought up earlier, the role of the state powers versus, the role of the federal powers, and the federal powers, the Constitution basically dictates that the states decide how they handle the voting. Every state selects its own representatives. Every state selects its own senators, and they in turn create the Electoral College, which then goes on, to elect the president. And then from there, president picks his staff, and the staff is confirmed by the senators and the representatives. So this is one of those things. The SAVE Act is a presumption of federal power over something that is rightfully held by the states. Mm-hmm. At the end, even if they were to go to Congress and say, hey, our senators, congressmen pass this at the federal level, you still need to get the legislators in each state, the governors in each state, to basically bless off on it, because every state has standing in the Supreme Court in order to have that law overturned. Now, one of the things that you can think about from the perspective of the SAVE Act, the reason why everybody's so interested in seeing the SAVE Act succeed is because of how much power is held by the federal government right now. You know, we talk about the control, it controls trade. Mm-hmm. It controls medicine. It controls the money. It controls national emergency reserves. You know, all of these different things are powers that have been assumed by the federal government, you know, since we created the Constitution back in 1786. So what are the real way that we should be doing this is, rather than trying to consolidate power with the SAVE Act in the federal government in Washington, D.C., which is 3,000 miles away from Idaho, is we should be doing everything we can to disempower the federal government so that these larger states like California can't use their larger representation in the House of Representatives to overpower the state, you know, smaller states like Idaho and Wyoming. You know, we need to be able to go in and say, okay, you know, we've had enough of this federal level bullying of the states. We're tired of the House of Representatives using these unlimited funds from this central bank and the power to print money, you know, in order to bribe the states into performing certain rituals of humiliation, of giving away our power. You know, so let's not empower them more. Let's go into Washington. Let's be hard on Washington. Say, you know, we're tired of this role that you've taken in our lives. You know, it's time for you to give some of that up. And as representatives of the people, that would be our job. Because power is derived, political power is derived from the consent of the governed. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a philosophy we believe here in the state of Idaho. You know, it's derived from the people. Yep. You know, and it's something we need to take to Washington and say, look, we need to trim the bureaucracy. We need to disempower Washington. We need to give the powers back to the state. And let's take care of the people that way.
Yeah, 100%. Go ahead.
Yeah, so David here, I think it's fair that all you need an ID to vote. Yeah, now that's one of those things that's interesting, David. Saying you don't is kind of like saying it's intellectually having a fraudulent election in my mind. Now, I actually talked about this with a gentleman on another podcast here recently, and that is Idaho has one of the most secure elections in the United States. It is traceable by paper ballot. We refresh the voter rolls every 2 years. If you haven't voted within 2 years or otherwise registered to vote, you know, change something on your voter registration, such as your party or your location, your address, within the last 2 years, Idaho drops you from the rolls. No ifs, ands, or buts. You know, if there's no trace of you actually using your privilege to vote, your right to vote, you got to go in and reapply for it. And in order to apply, in order to register to vote, you need to have ID.
Yep.
You know, it's not an issue that you have it at the polling station, but in order to register to vote, you need to have an ID.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, to speak that to as well, I think there's a lot of misinformation in regards to it as well, because I agree that everybody should have a voter ID, and I'm I have seen so few instances of actual voter fraud across the states, in regards to other states, even the states that don't require voter ID. I don't see judgments against saying like there's an exorbitant amount, like 9,000 fake votes or anything in that regards. I've seen little mini ones like 9 or 10 here and there, but to s- I just have a hard time with saying that there's this huge massive issue when there's not massive amounts of judgments or judicials or any institutions of these states coming back and saying like, yeah, we're having a problem or because of these complaints that somebody's taken those courts to the case, and they've put it, but it's just I don't see the evidence for a massive amount of voter fraud, and I
Uh,
think
and, and it's interesting because you actually have two different kinds of things here, and they tend to get a little mixed up. One is voter fraud, and the other is election fraud. A voter is when I go in and I lie about who I am as a voter in order to cast a vote, that isn't my right to vote or cast. Election fraud happens on the other end. That's one of those things that we see a lot of is election fraud. We see the people who count the ballots
Mhm.
not counting them fairly, or misrepresenting the count. And I see more of that, which again, coming back to Idaho doesn't have that problem. The Secretary of State goes through and audits
Yeah.
the counties after every election. Okay, randomly, they really only got time to audit about, a quarter of them. But they do the audit.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's not like it can go that long without somebody finding out, the possibility that a corrupt county clerk is miscounting Idaho ballots for a critical election. The chances of them getting caught are at least 1 in 5 every election.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, we don't play those odds for other things.
Right.
Um, let's go ahead. So one of the other things that comes in with that, let's skip that one and we'll come back to it. But refugees, and this is one of the things about voter fraud, or that a lot of people have concerns about voter fraud, is whether or not refugees are voting in Idaho elections legally. Are they or are they not being given IDs? Are they or are they not, you know, uh, changing the demographic votes in ways that Native Idahoans or Native Americans are want to see? What do you
Right.
think about the refugees here in the state?
Uh, it's a big question for me because I don't have a lot of issues with refugees in general, but if I'm going to look at the issue, I'm going to look at the issue from an aspect of what is happening to create these refugees. I'm big on we've caused a lot of destabilization across the world and last generations everything. Um I'm a big fan of restabilizing the world. We can do the same but opposite in these regions, and ideally in my ideal world what I'd like to do is I would like to restabilize these locations to where these refugees feel safe to go back to their home. In my that's what I fall with the refugees. Um, on the large scale, on the smaller scale, they do change demographics. I But they are still people, and we still need to be accounting for them. And we don't need to be marginalizing these already marginalized people that have been bombed out of their homes or starved out of their homes either. Um, but we do have to keep an eye and make sure that we keep Idaho, Idaho. But we also have to represent them in that aspect as well, and make sure that they are heard. But we do have to make sure that we're not overcome by refugees. Everybody lives in Idaho, um, and like I said, we need to make sure they're heard, represented. But I don't think we need to be taken over.
Right. So a lot of people have come into the area and they're not very familiar with the refugee resettlement program. Now, this has been in place for over, since 1970s. When we were taking in the Thai boat people, and the original arrangement was basically every one of these, okay, diasporas. A diaspora is when people from another nation, another culture, basically get cast out to the world and they travel the world and they end up in different places. Now, Idaho or the United States has been on the receiving end of several global diasporas. The Chinese, Jewish, blacks, somewhat forced from Africa, Japanese resettlement programs, when they left Japan, came to work in the United States. And thing is over the 200 years, between shipping and everything else, a lot of these were the idea that these people could come to America and work and send money home.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes back, Carnegie, Rockefeller, they were always looking for cheap labor, just like BlackRock is today, looking for cheap labor, bringing in, these individuals, refugees from a global perspective. Now, like you brought up, Joe, is what's causing this? The thing is we funded the Bush Wars, whether you call them the banana wars, when we went in, destabilized in order to create banana republics,
Yep.
When we stopped doing the banana republics in exchange for the oil republics, also that we can control a resource that is very specific to a region. We go in, we destabilize. What's going on right now? The price of oil globally is over $100 a barrel, and it's still rising. As the commodities exchange really begins to understand how much of an impact the Strait of Hormuz and the island of Karg has had on global fuel supplies. So we're seeing the cost of oil go up. Now, whether that was intentional or not, it's hard for those of us who have looked at history to go, no, that was no.
Right.
Accidents don't happen in the world of finance. They don't. They'll realign, reshape, figure out how to bundle loans into stocks and sell them as commodities. We've watched it with the housing market. We've watched it with the AI bubble. We watch it with venture capitalism. We've watched it with wars over the years. Smedley Butler, Marine, well-renowned. War's a racket.
Yep.
So when we set up to destroy oil fields in the Middle East by claiming Iran was going to attack us, no, we were just kicking off the fire sale.
Yeah, the banana wars. That is one of the stuff. I always just a little side piece here for the banana wars. It's one of my soapboxes that I always talk about. It's one of the first historical military incursions on the behalf of a corporation that I could find, because that's direct for United Fruit Corporation. We did military actions in the Central America, so and that's why we always talk about banana wars and stuff like that.
Yeah, and then rubber as well. When we were doing the hard rubber tires, before we figured out how to make petroleum-based rubber. Yeah, I mean, we do that all the time.
Yeah.
It just continues to be a problem. We use the military on a regular basis in order to facilitate financial gains for key industries here in the United States in the name of U.S. interests, in the name of national security interests.
Right.
And it's one of those that's extremely bad because every time we go in and do that, we destabilize a region. The native population doesn't want to stay where they are. They need to go someplace else. And one of the best places to be safe from U.S. foreign policy is
Domestic
the United States.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh.
but yeah. So talking about foreign policy, one of your questions here was Qatar Airmen training in Mountain Home Air Force Base.
Yeah, I mean,
that was a big thing. You know, we found out, you know, our representatives in DC, one of them sitting on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said that they had no idea we were moving a contingent, you know, building structures for Saudi Arabian princes to learn how to fly, you know, out of Mountain Home Air Force Base. What are your thoughts on that, Joe?
oh man. So cross country military training is something that happens quite often. I was in Romania for 6 months, and we were training with uh, United Kingdom and other nation states. So it's something that happens, but like you're saying, the fact that the public didn't know about it until it was like at the doorstep, that's not acceptable to me. If we're gonna do this, we're gonna get the will of the people. You know, interact with the people that it'll affect the most. Mountain Home Air Force Base or Mountain Home, in Elmore County and everything in that regards. To me, in a lot of regards, it sounds like it's a small detachment if it's still going to happen with everything else that's going on. But it sounded like it was a small detachment and teaching them how to work the F-15s and everything and training in that nature. But it's also one of those things where the people should know it shouldn't be hidden behind some opaque, we don't know what's going on inside of our government idea. And that's where I see the issue, is that it was not well known and well propagated throughout the needed communities to where it's actually affecting, Idaho and everything like that. I don't see it. I don't see an issue with cross training. I think that's good. Not letting the people know or not getting the okay from the people is problematic in my opinion.
So this one's actually an interesting thing because a couple of years ago, there was a big to-do here in the state of Idaho because the United States Air Force was planning on leasing airspace from the state of Idaho in order to do training for urban environment close air support. Okay, so this is where you got planes flying over, pretending that they're shooting hostiles or finding hostiles inside urban environments, inside cities. Now, I'd just gotten back from Afghanistan and at the time, and I'd been to Iraq, I'd been to Afghanistan, and I understood, because it's like one of the things I noticed while I was over there was how similar the terrain was, how similar some of the smaller villages were to the way that we do business here in the state of Idaho. You know, when you're looking at the small little towns, you know, little mountain villages, and you think of Driggs and Marsing and, you know, some of these other smaller communities like Shelley, and you go, wait, we're going to be flying attack craft over our towns to train people how to blow up people in other countries. And then you realize, wait, we're not just doing that with American pilots. We're using Saudi pilots and Qatari pilots and Taiwanese pilots, and they're flying Idaho skies, learning how to blow people up over Idaho cities and towns. And he was like, wait, I got some issues here, folks. I got some issues.
Yeah.
You know,
I didn't realize that they were opening the skyways for over smaller towns too, though, because I know we have like a lot of bombing ranges out in south or southern Idaho. I
oh
go
yeah.
next one, but that does add a little bit more of a question of like why are we doing this here?
Yeah, well, we got sort of two conjoined zones out there because Mountain Home has its bombing range.
Hmm.
And of course, we have the National Guard training facility here. You know, we bring in guardsmen on a regular basis in order to train them up. And of
Hmm.
course, they have the impact area for that as well. And they're kind of joined. So, in addition to having the skies to practice, you know, the close air support, target acquisition, you know, they still have the bombing runs that they do in other areas. And of course, one of the problems is with a lot of the foreign pilots, especially with regards to the Saudi and several others of, you know, certain cultural persuasions, is inshallah. You know, it is what it is, man. You know, if God decides that it's time for me to do something, so I'm going to do it. You
Right.
know, it's not my choice. It is sort of an excuse to do just about anything they want to do. And you have people with this philosophy, you know, doing flybys in downtown Boise with F-15s, and you're going, no. Bring back the Taiwanese. You know, they're at least courteous and they stay above, you know, the low zone. Uh, but to invite some of these where the ego and the attitude says that, no, I'll do what I want. I don't care about the laws. I have immunity. And when I'm done with the training, I'm headed back to my country. And it's like, yeah, no, I'm not comfortable with that sort of laissez-faire, you know, training opportunities, particularly for officers of countries that may or may not be good friends with us next week.
Yeah. That piece is just a little bit problematic, especially with the allyship, as tedious as it is in our current junction. Because it would be a bad deal if they're already out there during this time, especially.
Yeah.
There'd be-
Um, Second Amendment rights, we're going to go ahead and cover that one real quick here. So the Stand Your Ground Shield Act, SB 1298. Now, what do you think with regards to that and how it extends certain privileges and rights to situations where, I mean, you literally just killed somebody?
Right. I I really am in agreement with a lot of the two-way shield acts and stand your ground. Um, Self-defense is self-defense. I don't think people should be criminally prosecuted for it. And that was my understanding of the law, is that it prevented a criminal prosecution for an act of self-defense, essentially. That was my understanding of the legislation. So I really, I mean, I think we should have more castle laws. I think like being able to defend your own defend your own personage is very important aspect of the Second Amendment right. Like I've said before, well-regulated militia is part of our rights in the Second Amendment. It's enumerated, so we need to have it.
Yeah, and I'm in agreement with you on this. One of the things is Second Amendment rights, the right to self-defense. That is the right to defend life and liberty, the right to defend property. You know, these are Article 1, Section 1 of the Idaho State Constitution. You know, life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, you know, and choice. These are things that are core to Idaho values. They're core to American values. And the idea that you can prevent somebody from being able to defend their life, liberty, or property, or even act on behalf of someone else in defense of their life, liberty, or property is just completely alien to me. You know, now I do understand that there are a lot of people that are concerned, will all of these situations in which somebody dies, are they really self-defense? Or was there hostile intent in the beginning? Because that's one of those things is, are you looking at this situation from the perspective of, were there witnesses? Or were they done in a situation where there were no witnesses?
Right.
You know, and this is one of those things, the benefit of the doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And it is one of the core principles of American justice.
Yep.
In order to find somebody guilty, you have to be able to show beyond a reasonable doubt, well, beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's one of those things, the civil law versus the criminal law. What is reasonable doubt versus what is, being able to sue an individual for damages versus putting someone in prison for life over the same incident are two distinctly different court and trial processes.
Right.
But to be able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was indeed a homicide as opposed to self-defense, is one of those things we really need to be able to appreciate here in the state of Idaho and in American law in general.
Yeah. I agree. Innocent until proven guilty.
Absolutely. Innocent until proven guilty. Yeah, we already talked about the energy output for AI and, the impending energy crisis as we continue to lose more and more oil resources and natural resources from other nations.
I know.
We covered quite a bit in the last 75 minutes here, Joe.
Yes, sir.
We got a couple people here watching. Any of you got a question before we sign off here? David, you've been busy. Here you go. UFC at the White House. Would you go?
Man. So I'm not a big UFC watcher anyways. I like the highlights and everything. I don't think so. I don't. It's one of those things because really I'm it's a flip of a coin because would it be an experience to watch a UFC fight at the White House? Yes. Would I feel like was partaking in the corruption and everything else in that nature? Yes. So it'd be damned if I do, damned if I don't. But I think honestly, I'd probably have to pass. I'd have to just take. No, I'm okay with that. I don't need to be watching UFC at the White House, even though it'd be something I'd be able to tell everybody about.
Part of this harkens back to the fall of Rome for me, the Colosseums. Actually moving the Colosseum into Caesar's palace, just doesn't exactly bode well for the nature of a republic or for an empire, considering the current stage of where we are. Of course, historians are going to debate, which stage of the fall of Rome are we currently in. I think the idea of that sort of nonchalance with the credibility of the federal government is a place we shouldn't be going. We should be everything in its place and a place for everything. Our halls of governance shouldn't be turned into spectacles or theater. There is a role for the White House. There is a role for 1600 Pennsylvania. There is a role for Congress. And to turn it into gladiatorial sports just seems undignified. So, yeah, David, I wouldn't be too keen on attending that event, except at gunpoint.
Yeah.
And even then, I wouldn't be keen on it. Okay. With that, Joe, go ahead. Give your sign off.
Joe Morrison running for United States Congress District 1 against Russ Fulcher in the Republican Party. You can find me at morrisonforidaho.com. That's Morrison for the number 4 ID.com. And all my other socials and everything else goes from there.
Yeah. And I'm Joe Evans, joeevansforidaho.com. You can find me on Twitter at IDJoe4, number 4 Idaho. You can also take a look around. Now, Joe and I, we've been doing this. This is our third iteration, like I said. We have a standing invitation for the other GOP candidates with the primaries coming up. Let Joe or I know. We'll get you in here. You can have this chat with all of us, get 5, 6, 10 of us all in here at the same time talking about the issues. We won't be able to cover as many issues, but by all means, if you know somebody who wants to join us, wants to have that conversation, let us know. We'll get them in on Thursday night. Take care.
You as well. Thank you.